Welcome everyone to the second in my 6-part live webinar series. I'm really excited to talk with you today about the topic, one of my favorites, increasing speed in philanthropy. Because I don't know about you, but in my experience, philanthropy moves at the speed of snails. So today I want to be giving you a lot of very practical ideas, tips, strategies that you can use, you as an individual, and also you as your entire organization to speed things up in philanthropy. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how sometimes it's important to go slow in order to go fast, and share with you some specific strategies around one of my favorite pet peeves in philanthropic slowness, which is strategic planning. And I'm going to give you some strategies to conduct strategic planning in 6 weeks and even 6 hours. So let's not delay and go ahead and get started. I want to share with you also that you have an option for doing Q&A on your screen. You can just hit the Q&A button and ask questions at any time. I'll be periodically looking over at my computer to check your questions and answer them, and Lori, my assistant, will be available to do some behind-the-scenes help if you're having any technological difficulties. Hopefully not. Okay, wonderful. And we have all kinds of participants joining us. There's folks, looks like, dialing in from everywhere, from California to the Middle East. So I'm excited to have all of you on with me today. The first thing I want to talk about is why slowness is a problem in philanthropy. And I believe it's all really about impact, because as funders, we're seeking to have an impact generally on people's lives. And when people's lives are at stake, I think it's really important for philanthropy to seek to make dramatic change as quickly as possible. If we really believe that what we do matters, I think it's incumbent upon us to do it as not only as thoughtfully, but as swiftly and quickly as we can. There's a lot of examples in philanthropy where taking too much time delays our ability to have an impact, or just delays the impact longer than it needs to be. So for example, if it takes your board 6 months just debating whether or not you want to engage in policy advocacy work, and finally you come to the conclusion 6 months later, yeah, let's give it a shot, well, in those 6 months you might have missed an important policy or legislative window, and you can't go back in time to have an impact on that piece of legislation. Or, for example, you might spend inordinate amounts of time doing all of your research and designing your next funding initiative. You've copy edited your RFP. I mean, you've looked at everything you possibly can, and then you realize, oh my gosh, this took a long time. We need to hurry up the application process, and you truncate the amount of time you now give your grant applicants to apply for funding. You get the money out the door. The problem with the delay in setting up this whole project and then truncating the amount of time applicants have to apply is it's likely you're going to be funding organizations that are not going to be successful because they were then rushed to deal with your delays on the planning and design end. And I know of a lot of grantees that have just simply stopped and refused to apply for funding from certain foundations because they find that the foundation moves way too slow, their grant application processes are too cumbersome, too many hoops to jump through, and they simply stop applying. And it's really hard as a foundation to achieve your mission if you don't have any grantees, because chances are you're not going to be doing the work. You need the grantees to be out there doing the work with you. So speed is important in philanthropy, and I want to spend the next remainder of our hour giving you some very specific strategies for how to do that. So let's first talk about you as individuals, because of course organizations are essentially made up of individuals, and if you all are so busy and your days are so jam-packed, you don't have time to think, and collectively you don't have time to speed up the work of your foundation. So I'm going to give you some 15 very practical and tactical tips, but some of them also require you to think about your work differently and to really adopt a different kind of mindset in your work. So let's go. So the first one is, don't check your email first thing in the morning. Because when you do this, as many of you do, you're giving away control of your time and of your mental energy and of your agenda and your goals for the day to other people, whoever happens to have emailed you earlier that morning or perhaps the night before. So it gets you off track at the beginning of your day and causes you to waste time. Instead, number 2 is to spend the first hour of your day doing something creative or productive or something that has been causing you stress that you just want to finish and get it off your plate. Now, by creative, I don't mean like artistic, although that would be interesting, but I mean doing something that generates ideas, is giving you energy. For example, when I created this live webinar series, I did it between 6 and 7 in the morning one morning in last November with a really strong cup of coffee to wake me up. But in that hour, the first hour of my day, I came up with all the topics and all the content ideas for this webinar series in an hour. And, at 7 o'clock, I was stoked. I was excited. I had, gotten this thing figured out. I had lots of energy, and it was 7 in the morning. I had all kinds of time the rest of the day to get other things done. So spending that first hour of your day doing something, it could be brainstorming your next funding initiative. It could be thinking about the kind of board members you want to have, your professional development goals for the year, whatever it might be, or that thing that's been nagging at you. Get it done, and then you won't be thinking about it the rest of the day, and it won't be draining your energy and your time. Related to something you should do at the beginning of the day is to set your top 3 priorities for the day. That could include this one thing, this one creative thing you just did, but it should also include personal priorities. The doctor's appointment you've been meaning to make. Go ahead and make that a priority for your day. A lot of my clients actually email me their top 3 priorities, just to make it official. Not that I'm going to do anything with that information, but just to kind of note them, email them to somebody, and make it official and try to focus on those 3 things that day. The 4th tactic is to prevent technology from taking over. I think in this world of technological improvements, we are constantly distracted. So this means things like removing all notifications from your phone and your computer, like stop CNN from popping up on your screen, or Facebook, or Instagram, or some messaging service, or the fact that you have a new email, or whatever it is. No one really knows how these notifications got on our computers, right? But we have control to actually remove them and going through our settings and removing them. You should also ruthlessly unsubscribe to email subscriptions that you never signed up for or don't want. Except, of course, My Confident Giving newsletter. You should definitely subscribe to that. But seriously, our emails and inboxes are bombarded by content that we didn't actually want ever and don't serve us any purpose. And every time we look at that stuff, it just distracts us from what we're working on. So ruthlessly unsubscribe. Don't just delete. Or transfer all that stuff to other kinds of folders. You don't need to know that Ann Taylor is having a 60% off sale today. Siphon that off to some kind of other folder so that you can look at it later. Speaking of email, check email 3 times a day, not all day. So again, don't check it first thing in the morning, but at some point in the morning, take a look at it, answer what needs to be answered, delete what you can delete. Midday, look at it again, maybe around lunchtime, and at the end of the day, as you're wrapping up your day, look at your inbox and see what you haven't taken care of yet and try to clear it out. But when we allow ourselves to look at email all day long, again, it really distracts us and it allows other people to take control of our schedule and our time. So, speaking of email, it's okay to reply to other people's email by saying thank you, or yes, or no. I think often we feel that we need to take time to go into these lengthy responses, and then we read them and reread them and edit them. That 10 minutes, you do that 5 times, 6 times a day, that's an hour of your day just in responding to email, when a yes would simply suffice. Now, I'll tell you a funny story. I actually had a client. He was a national project director of a foundation, and he was really good at this. Yes, no, okay, thanks. And one of his program officers that reported to him, it made her a little nervous because, with email, you can't read intonation. So she was like, was that yes enthusiastic, or was that yes ho-hum, or was that you're annoying me, stop emailing me, yes? And so she asked him, are you frustrated? Are you mad? And he was like, no, I'm just saying yes. So then he changed and he would say yes, exclamation point, or yes, thanks, to make her feel a little bit better. The 6th, speaking of mindsets, a mindset to adopt, and I might have mentioned this in the last webinar, is to have a mantra where you're constantly trying to cut the time in half of whatever you're working on. So you're writing a speech. How can I do this in half the time? You're Developing a communications plan, how can we do this in half the time? Your board meetings or preparing for board meetings, how can we do this in half the time? And if you really adopt that, it'll force you to rethink why you're doing certain things or how you're doing certain things. Maybe you don't need to meet in person, it could be by phone. Or maybe you need to rethink your agendas for these meetings and get other kinds of transaction business done in other means through email or whatever, and focus on really meaty issues or goal-focused issues in meetings. So it might require you to rethink your work, but if you adopt it as a mantra, you can really kind of make it into a game where you ask yourself this, and as teams and organizations, you're brainstorming ways to do things in half the time. Number 7 is to identify your procrastination destination. And this is a tip I got from a fellow consultant named Val Wright. Your procrastination destination is literally the place you go, either physically or mentally, when you're procrastinating. When you're putting off the report you need to write, or you're putting off whatever you need to be doing, where do you go? And it's worth thinking about that and maybe reflecting on it, or in the next week, kind of making note of it as you're procrastinating. For some people, it's Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. For other people, it might be, they start walking the halls and talking to people. Whatever it is, it's delaying you and taking up time in your day. And so you need to identify it, figure out why you're procrastinating, what do you need to focus on, but then try to eliminate it from your work. So if Facebook is your procrastination destination, remove the app from your phone so that you're not constantly looking at it throughout the day. The 8th is to calculate the cost of your time. Now, in my experience working with foundation leaders, most do not think at all about how much time, things cost in terms of staff time, their own or their employees. So I want to give you a little visual over here of what I'm talking about. So the example I want to share with you is the cost of planning for a business trip. So this is just a very simple example. You all spend time planning for business trips, right? But what often we do is we spend an inordinate amount of time researching the cheapest hotels, the cheapest flights, what the public transportation is to get there so you don't have to take a cab. You're trying to save money, which is great, but you're figuring out, okay, we can't afford the conference hotel. Are there any hotels cheaper within a 10-block radius? Or, maybe there's a cheaper flight, there's a non-stop, but I bet if I had 1 or 2 stops, I could save some money. So here you've spent 3 hours, which I think is conservative, quite frankly, researching travel, right? And then the new travel itinerary you've created for yourself is 5 hours longer each way, because you have 1 or 2 stops, and instead of taking a taxi or Uber, you're now taking like a bus and a subway, right? So you have 10 hours there and back of extra time. So you have 13 additional hours that you're now going to be you're spending in order to save, let's just say $500 on travel costs. So you're excited, right, because you are saving $500 in travel costs. You're not paying any attention to the 13 hours that you're wasting. So if you take, let's say, a salary of a senior level person in a foundation, let's say you make $125,000, plus 25% for benefits on average, so that's $156,000. Now, if you divide that by, there's 2,080 working hours per year, you can calculate what your average, your hourly rate is, which most people never think about when you have a salaried position. So that is $75 an hour. If you multiply that by 13 hours, it's costing $975 to save $500. And this is the point that I want to make, that very few foundations ever think about this, but think about not only you're actually wasting foundation money now, but think of how much more you could have gotten done in that 13 hours, right? Or think about the cost of how exhausted you're going to be the next day, because chances are that trip forced you to get up at 4 in the morning, or come home at midnight, or just spending all day in 1 or 2 airports is exhausting. And so the productivity time for you when you arrive at your important meeting or conference, or when you return, I think is an important cost consideration. All right, number 9 is saying no. Tip number 9 is to learn how to just say no. So, and I'm not talking about the typical, say no to a grantee that isn't qualified doesn't meet your guidelines, but I mean saying no to all those requests for our time that really are not advancing our own personal goals or our foundation's goals. So saying no to a nonprofit asking you to join its board when you really don't want to, but you feel obligated. Or saying no when people contact you and say, can I pick your brain? I want to work for a foundation. Or can I take you out for coffee? I want to, learn about your work. Right? Now, of course, it's important to be open, especially to grantees and the community, to learn about what's going on. But there are all kinds of time suckers out there trying to take our time. And I think we can think about ways that we can still be useful and helpful without us having to physically devote our time to doing it over time. For example, one of my clients is the Director of Race, Equity, and Inclusion at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Now, they've done a great job of operationalizing equity at that foundation, so much so that all the time foundation leaders are calling her and saying, can I talk to you? I want to learn how you went about doing this. We're trying to incorporate equity into our work. We're not quite sure how. Could you fly out? We'll pay you to fly out and meet with our board or do a training or help us figure this out, right? To the extent that this could literally be a full-time job for her. She gets that many requests. And she recognized this early on, so she very smartly decided to, as part of her strategy in her work, was to pay for the writing and creation of various documents that are telling the story about how that foundation is operationalizing equity in its work. Not only for themselves, because as a large foundation, they might have 40 or 50 new employees each year, and she wanted to be able to help them understand the foundation's journey and why this is important. But she also wanted to ensure that these documents could be shared with the whole field, so that she had a body of work that she could send to other foundations to help them understand these issues and explore their strategies, and she wouldn't have to physically be the one doing that. Okay, number 10 is making sure you get enough sleep. Now, I don't know if you guys have been looking at the research on sleep or lack of sleep lately, but it's stunning in its severity. Lack of sleep is a true health problem, and it has significant implications, negative implications for our health. Now, I have learned this because I suffered from insomnia up until just a year or so ago. And severe insomnia is defined by, not getting whatever amount of sleep per night for like 2 weeks. Well, I was not getting enough sleep for like 2 years. And what I wanted, quite frankly, was someone to give me a drug that would make me sleep. But luckily, I went to a sleep psychologist who gave me some strategies for how to make sure that I slept through the night. Because as you can imagine, if you're sleep deprived night after night, week after week, you're not very successful. And I think a lot of people, really are in our lives, and maybe many of you, how many hours of sleep did you get last night? I think a lot of us are walking around in sort of a zombie state powered by caffeine, and it's really it's a health problem. And I think it's important that we all, make sure we're not only drinking our 8 glasses of water a day, but getting our 8 hours of sleep a day. Number 11 is to pick up the phone and call people instead of emailing them. We think that email is faster and more efficient, but actually, in my experience, it can take a lot longer to get things done. I think that we believe that if we call people, A, they won't be there, or B, we'll be bothering them. But I recommend to you, every time you want to go email somebody in the next week, pick up the phone and call them instead. You'd be surprised by how many people actually answer the phone. Or they have assistants who are there at the ready to help you get a meeting scheduled or even answer your question. Because that email back and forth of getting things done, that can delay things for weeks. And a phone call, you could get something accomplished literally in 5 minutes. Number 12, another mindset is that when you're 80% there, you move. So this is an example of the 80-20 rule. When you're 80% there, you move. Meaning, once you've gotten 80% of whatever you're getting done, or 80% of it is figured out, or 80% of the article is written, whatever it is, consider it done and move on it. Start working, because that remaining 20%, if you really tried to get those last details figured out, you're going to end up spending about 50% more time on that last 20%, and it's going to be inconsequential anyway. It's far better to get that 80% done, start moving on it with the confidence that you can make course corrections along the way. And I mean, literally, if you're writing an article or a speech, you're 80% done, consider it done. Send it to a copy editor or a proofreader to fix it or whatever, move on it. If you're launching a new funding initiative, I mean, of course you want to make sure that it's research-based and evidence-based practices and all that, but there's a point where you can't answer every question. You can't read every research report. By 80%, you have figured out enough of whatever the topic is, whatever your strategies are, that you can start moving on them immediately. Number 13, identify your productivity propensity. And by this I mean, figure out what are the conditions in which you are most productive. So for some people, productivity means if I have a big project, I can tackle it in bite-sized bits, 1 hour a day over time. That works for them. Other people, that's very stressful. They'd rather dedicate a whole day or a couple of days to just focus on one issue. Or you might be most productive in certain kinds of working environments, with music, without music, whatever it might be, but get clear on what are the conditions in which you're most productive, and then work to change your schedule or arrange your office or your space to be productive. Number 14, we're almost done with this list. As a general rule, figure out what other people could be doing so that you don't have to. So for example, as a manager, you might be conducting performance reviews with your team. So after you're talking to one of your direct reports about their performance, instead of them leaving and you sitting down and summarizing all of that discussion, ask your employee to summarize the discussion. Email it to you. You take a look at it. If it looks good, file it away. You're done. If you want some changes made, you just email them what the changes need to be, and you're done. So you've offloaded that work. You didn't have to do it. And you've helped that person really understand and internalize that conversation better. And then the last one I want to share with you is a fun exercise, and I'm going to share my screen. I call this the joy, hate, delegate exercise. So this is literally to make a list of all the activities that you do in your work, or it could even be in your personal life. Make a long list. You might want to organize it and group it by categories, if that makes sense for you. And then create 3 columns to the right of that list. It brings me joy, it gives me energy is one. The second one is, it's okay, but I could easily delegate it to somebody else. And the last one is, I hate it, it's like sucking the life out of me, right? And then go through your list. I mean, here I wrote things like conducting site visits, developing partnerships, speaking, these performance write-ups, developing budgets, whatnot. And then go through it and check where it falls for you, right? So conducting site visits, you can do them and you might even like them, but your program officers could also do them, or others in your foundation. Performance write-ups, I just gave you an example of how that could be delegated to the person whose job it is. I did this for myself and a number of years ago, and found so many kind of communication-related activities, posting on social media, setting up my blogs, whatnot, that I created a whole job description that I delegated to a consulting firm. So in this case, this person really likes developing partnerships and speaking, so is probably a very outwardly focused person. So what you should really try to do is create your job so that you're focused on only the items that are giving you joy, and the rest of it either get rid of, like maybe it doesn't have to be done anymore, or you could do it in half the time, or there's a much easier way to accomplish it, or delegate it to somebody else. So let me just pause for a moment and see if there are any questions. This is a great question. It says, this may seem obvious, but how do you define speed? And I define speed by organization plus consistency equals speed. Organization plus discipline equals speed. So speed is a matter of being organized, and not just organized, one time or one-off times, but being organized consistently and having a discipline to organization so that you can constantly speed things up. So for example, my very first example that I gave about not checking email first thing in the morning, like that might be fun for a couple of days, and then you slide back into your old habits of waking up, grabbing your phone, and checking your email. Instead, have that level of organization, but be disciplined about doing it consistently all of the time? So, great question. Another question is, what are some of the reasons why foundations move so slowly? This is a great question. I think a lot of it has to do with fear, actually. I think it's fear of making mistakes. I think it's fear of not having enough information. I think a lot of slowness in philanthropy comes when, especially when you're doing planning work, you want to, make sure that all of your ideas have been well researched and you've vetted them multiple times with all your board members. You've had a zillion community meetings and engaged stakeholders. And while all that's important, and I'm not saying not do it, I think often we do it beyond the point at which it needs to be done. And it's a fear that we're not getting it right, or we haven't engaged everybody, or we haven't given all of our board members 3 times opportunities to reflect on whatever it is and give us input, things like that. But I think, in philanthropy, what is there to fear? I mean, of course we want to do our work well, but we can make course corrections along the way. No one's shooting at you in philanthropy. There are professions where people are actually shooting at them. That's part of the job description. If you're a police officer, you're going to get shot at. Well, working in a foundation is not a job where anyone's likely to be shooting at you. So I think we need to let go of that fear and really focus on that, on that rule of when you're 80% there, you move, and you can always make course corrections along the way. I think there's also a lack of urgency because we don't have a lot of external pressure on us to be speedy. I mean, really, the world is not going to end if you take 6 weeks or 6 months to do strategic planning, right? You're not going to get penalized. And quite frankly, the power dynamic of philanthropy, I think, contributes to the slowness because the people who are most likely to be annoyed by how slow we're moving are the ones we're funding, and they're not likely to complain when they're simultaneously asking for a grant. So I think those are the 3 main reasons why foundations move so slowly. Great. So let me move on to the next point I want to make, which is about organization-wide change. So I think it's really important for foundations and organizations to try to speed their work up also. Again, focus on speed to impact. And this is really a matter of consistently lifting up our own hoods and identifying areas of duplication, waste, redundancy, barriers to decision-making, policies and procedures that no longer serve us. And then systematically try to figure out how to eliminate them or dramatically improve or change them. This is actually very easy to do because everyone probably can think of some in their work, and I bet a lot of your staff in your foundations can think of a lot of them as well, things that have been frustrating to them. They just haven't had an opportunity to voice their frustrations. Often, this happens not because anyone's doing anything wrong, but everyone's so busy, because they're busy checking email first thing in the morning, or because they, just never took the time or paid attention to this, or because that's the way things are done around here and no one questions it, or there hasn't been a culture developed in the organization to question or to create change or to support continuous improvement. Marshall Goldsmith says, what got you here won't get you there. And I often advise my clients that the things that made sense when the foundation first started, or even 5 years ago, the policies, the staffing structure, your org chart, your board committees, whatever it is, those things made sense then, but might not make sense anymore. You might have just grown past them, and they need to change. And so you have to regularly look under your own hood. And so how do you do this? I was actually just talking to a foundation CEO in Boston last week who said, great, this sounds great, but what do we actually do, and how do we go about this? And I think it's about 3 things, really. Low-hanging fruit, really finding what are the quick and easy wins we can have. Keeping it simple. This doesn't have to be a complex process to do this. And also having fun with it and trying to make sure that it's fun and rewarding and people aren't feeling blamed, but you're collectively trying to make improvements. So I think a couple things. One is you can simply start with your team, if that team is you. I mean, some of you are the one staff person at your foundation, but that could include your trustees or all your staff or the program that you're working in. But as a team, brainstorm, have everyone go around the table and simply ask, what's something that I'm doing that is frustratingly slow or cumbersome or duplicative, and how do I, and then brainstorm. Either they come up with solutions, or collectively you can brainstorm what are some solutions to pretty dramatically make an improvement in either changing that or reducing it in half, or whatever you want to do. Or each week at a staff meeting, or each month at a staff meeting, you can take one aspect of your foundation, HR, the legal department, the grants management, whatever it might be, and collectively brainstorm, where are things getting slowed down or bogged down, and how can we bust through those barriers and make change to speed things up. I think it's important, as I mentioned, not to really focus on the positive. No one's to blame. But there's ways that we can all improve. I think it's important for the CEO to model this and identify ways that he or she is also slow or duplicative or wasting people's time, and acknowledging that and making changes. And you can also think about how do you reward people and have rewards for the most time saved or whatever it might be. I do want to go and share with you, well, I'll do that in a second. So I want to share with you 3 mindsets or approaches of that are important to think about and keep in mind as you're doing this work. So the first is identify what constitutes success and then work backwards to achieve it. So for example, if you're here, so this is your current state, and you're trying to get to your desired future state, I think it's important to think about what you're trying to get from here to here. How can we have dramatic change quickly? Like, what's the easiest way we could get from here to here with the fewest steps and the fastest process? Because if you have like a 5-step process for approving a $5,000 grant, for example, and you think about, what's the fastest way to get there? First of all, what's our change? What are we desiring to do differently? Well, maybe you could think about, what are these grants trying to accomplish? Are we trying to fund grassroots organizations? Are we trying to meet basic needs? And are there better ways to do it than lots of $5,000 grants, right? So maybe your desired future state is like revamping your whole program. Or maybe maybe we should make $10,000 or $25,000 grants instead, because it's hard to do much with $5,000, right? So what is your desired future state, and how do you get there quickly, as opposed to thinking about it incrementally, which is, okay, it's currently a 5-step process, so let's reduce it to 3 steps. You're going to make some change, and that's great, but you're not going to get to the dramatic change that you could reach. Another way to think about it is if we could create this from scratch today, what would it look like? If we could build this from the ground up today, what would it look like? Whatever it is, your program area, your legal department, your professional development strategy, your entire foundation, like whatever it is, if we started today from scratch, what would we create? And chances are you create something very different than what you have now. And this approach allows you to let go of all the baggage of what you currently have and really start fresh. So maybe what you would create is, let's create an app that would allow grantees to track progress of their application and would allow our staff to make funding decisions on the run while they're at various conferences and meetings and whatnot. You might come up with some really different approaches to your work. And then the third approach for organization-wide speeding things up is, again, to think about being content with making course corrections along the way, that you're going to make effective course corrections and not worry about plotting and the perfect course at the beginning. Again, it's that 80-20 rule. When you're 80% there, you move. Now, sometimes you don't know, there's a problem, but you don't really know exactly what's going on. You don't know enough about the problem, why things are so slow. And it's worth taking a little bit of time to figure that out. And one of the strategies that I find works the best is time tracking. So either having yourself or your team or everyone in your foundation spend some time over time tracking all of their activities and how much time they're taking, and then analyze that information and do something with it. So a donor was starting was trying to figure out how to start a new foundation. And she was frustrated that it was taking so long to get things moving. And so she did this time tracking exercise and learned that there were lots of different kinds of activities that could easily be delegated to an administrative assistant. Because she was working really hard, but she constantly felt busy and constantly felt overwhelmed and wasn't really making the progress she wanted to make. And she discovered that there were all these activities that weren't the best use of her time. So she hired a part-time administrative assistant, delegated all that stuff to the assistant, things like scheduling and reviewing proposals and doing some basic research and looking at office space and things like that. And it freed her up to focus on the bigger picture issues and the mission, the vision, the partnerships, and how do we get this underway. Doing this kind of work organization-wide might require you to rethink how you operate. It might require you to reorganize. It might require you to think about your people. Do you have the right people? Are they doing the right things? It might require investing in new technology. So one example is my firm was hired a few years ago to work with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation on their Forward Promise initiative, which is funding young men and boys of color. And they were trying to make 10 $500,000 grants to 10 different organizations. And they hired us to manage the whole RFP process for them. So we launched the RFP, and they received 1,200 proposals. 1,200 proposals. It was the most proposals they'd ever received for one initiative in the 40 years the foundation's been around. And we had to get that 1,200 down to 300, and then I think 50, and then 20 that would get site visits, and then 10 that would get funding. And what do you imagine was the fastest part of that whole process? Well, I'm here to tell you the fastest part was whittling down the 1,200 down to 300, because that foundation had invested the time and resources into a very robust and sophisticated online application and reviewing system. So all the applications were submitted online, and then we had a team of like 6 reviewers. We could assign them all electronically which proposals to read. We had the criteria up on the site. They could score them all online, and yada, yada, yada. It was done in like a week, right? It was shockingly fast because they had invested the time and technology. And a year later, I was explaining the story to a colleague. This colleague had been involved decades ago, advising the same foundation, Robert Wood Johnson, on another large initiative. And he said, Chris, the way that would have happened 20 years ago is a FedEx truck or a caravan of FedEx trucks would have backed into the foundation and offloaded 1,000 FedEx packages, right? I mean, can you imagine like unfurling all the FedEx envelopes and then entering all that information in the computer and then making duplicate copies and sending them to everybody? I mean, that would have been months of many people's time just getting those applications ready to be reviewed. I just want to say briefly, it isn't all about figuring out what's wrong and then fixing it within your organization. It's also about identifying your own internal best practices and then seeing if those can be replicated across the foundation. Because there's a lot of strengths that you have and things that you're doing really well and in ways that you're agile and ways that you are speedy. It's a matter of identifying where those are and can you disseminate them. So, for example, Mercedes-Benz, the company, many years ago, recognized that a lot of its dealerships were not profitable and had a lot of problems. And so their immediate thought was, let's go look at external best practices. What other dealerships, what other car brands are effective in how they organize their dealerships, and what can we learn from them? And the consultant they hired to do this work said, you know what, that isn't really the way to go. Is it all of your dealerships that are doing badly or just some of them? And they said, oh no, some of them are doing spectacularly well. And so he said, okay, well, let's look at the ones that are doing well, see what those internal best practices are, and disseminate that to the rest of your dealerships. And that saved them time and a lot of money to build on their own strengths. And I think Philanthropy can apply that lens as well. I want to spend just a minute on grantees, because of course it's important to streamline and speed up our work with grantees. A lot of work has been written about this already, especially with a project called Project Streamline, which you should definitely take a look at. But I want to lift up a couple examples of a foundation in particular that is doing a phenomenal job speeding things up, and that's actually the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, one of the largest in the United States and in the world, that has a couple practices that are worth paying attention to. One is they allow, some of their program areas allow grantees to submit proposals previously written for other foundations and just submit them as is without taking the time to figure out changing anything to reflect this is for the Hewlett Foundation, even though it's the same proposal we just submitted to the Packard Foundation. You can just submit it as is, thereby saving the grantee hours and hours of time. They also allow their program officers to make grant recommendations up to $1 million that only require the executive director, the CEO of the foundation, to approve, not the board. $1 million. That's a common practice. And for general operating support grants, often they allow the applicant to submit only their annual report and their financials. That's all they need to do to submit to get a general operating support grant in many cases. They don't need to put a proposal together. So those are just some examples. You know, foundations, as they get bigger, they generally get more cumbersome and add more policies and procedures and create more barriers and get slower, right? Well, this is a huge foundation doing some really cool things that I think other funders should pay attention to. All right, let me just pause for questions. What suggestions do you have for shortening board meetings? That's a great question. I would just really briefly say I would think about shortening not just the board meeting, but the entire board meeting process. You know, all the time spent between starting to prepare for a board meeting and the actual board meeting, and quite frankly, the recovery from the board meeting, because people are usually exhausted afterwards. I would apply that same time tracking strategy and actually have your staff, all of them, calculate how much time you spend for every board meeting preparing for them, preparing the dockets, you know, writing the summaries, and then there's like the summaries of the summaries, and then there's the one-line summaries of the summaries, and collating and stapling and putting whatever, all that stuff, and then the rehearsals and everything. Because it's very common for foundation leaders to tell me things like, you know what, in the next month we're out of pocket, all of our staff are preparing for the board meeting. Meaning they're not available. All they're doing for a month is preparing for the board meeting. Well, the board meets 4 times a year. That's 4 months out of the year. So just think about how much time is wasted. And there's lots of ways, and I can talk to you more about this offline, there's lots of ways to speed that process up. Okay. So I'm going to turn off my Q&A. I want to talk really briefly on when to go slow to go fast, because I think this is really important. And I'm going to just share 2 ideas with you. One is when your instinct says something's wrong or to slow down. So one example of this is I was working with a foundation leader, and I was helping them to launch a new funding initiative focused on youth issues. And it was working in a whole new community, and you know, there were a variety of organizations all trying to improve youth outcomes in a certain county. And we were looking for kind of the one organization to be the intermediary organization to lead the work. And there was one organization that sort of looked good on paper. You know, they were already playing that role, they had the capacity to re-grant, they knew all the other organizations. But my client said, you know what, I don't really trust this person. There's something about them that I just don't feel right about. But he convinced himself to make the grant anyway and fund this organization to do the work and this leader to do the work because they were the right organization on paper, and he went against his instinct. Well, not surprisingly, months down the road, it turned out to be a bad grant. The leader actually publicly embarrassed this foundation leader in a meeting. There were all kinds of things that went awry. And really it was, I think, ultimately because the foundation leader just did not follow his own instinct. And I think it's really important. It's okay to slow down because ultimately it will speed things up. By not trusting his instinct, the whole process got slowed down because then we had to start it all over again and lost a lot of the relationship building that had been underway. Another time to go slow to go fast, I think, is when you're creating something new. Especially when it's something you don't think you know much about. our instinct, I think, is often to go look elsewhere, like talk to other people, go on Google, find information to inform us. But I think the first thing that we need to do when we're launching anything new is to spend an hour with a notepad and a pen or a laptop, your computer, whatever you use, your tablet, and just to brainstorm and write down everything you can think of about that issue or topic. Because you'll be stunned at how much you actually know about something that you think you have no information or knowledge about. Because you're smart and you're experienced in all kinds of things that are relevant to whatever it is. So to be specific, I was talking recently with a new community foundation CEO. She had never been a foundation CEO before, and she had never worked in development before, and she was trying to figure out how to do planned giving. And her instinct was, let me call 10 people that know about planned giving and find a planned giving consultant and issue an RFP and bring somebody on and yada, 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 which would probably take 6 months to do. And I said, no, that's not what you should do. The first thing you should do is sit down with yourself and think of everything you know about planned giving. And you can do it. Like, who do you think your ideal donors are? How has the foundation been working with them thus far? What are better ways to engage them? Why would a donor want to give money to your foundation as a planned gift? Who are the top 3 people you can think of that are experts in planned giving, and what can you learn from them? Like, whatever it is, right? Spend an hour. You'll be 75% there of what you need to know. And the rest of the 25%, you can hire other people to help you or figure out from other resources. But start with yourself first. It will save you a lot of time. So it's, again, kind of slowing down your instinct to jump on Google and taking time with yourself to figure that out. Okay. So in the remaining time that we have, I would like to talk about strategic planning and delve into some strategies to improve strategic planning in real time in the next 13 minutes. So this is one of my personal pet peeves, because I think at this point in time, it's really impossible to plan out 10 years or 5 years or even 3 years. 1 to 2 years is much more realistic given how fast things are changing these days. And yet foundations often will, create a 3-year strategic plan and spend 18 months developing that plan. So you're now over halfway into your new period of time. I mean, the world's already changed by the time that you're done. So I think this is an area that there can be lots of ways to make improvements. I think it's also important for people to think about strategy formulation versus strategy implementation. So strategy formulation is really thinking about your desired state. Where do you want to be? Painting the picture of what you want to be in the future. What's the kind of organization you want to be? What's the kind of impact that you want to have? Literally, what do you want to sound like, smell like, look like, feel like 1 year from now or 2 years from now or 3 years from now? What is that desired future state? And then strategy implementation is how you get there. It's the people and the structures and the processes you put in place to get from here to there. So let me just do a quick... Yeah, so here we are with our example we talked about before. So your current state, what is your desired future state? And really, this is your implementation plan, right? Getting from here to there. And it's people, it's structures, which is really how the people interact, right? And it's processes. So the people, the structures, and the processes. So how people come together and how they interact with each other. And so really what you're trying to do is get from here to there as quickly and dramatically as possible. So this is my approach to, one of my approaches to 6-week strategy development. So this is formulating your strategy, right? So what I've outlined is the sort of the timeline. So the first 3 weeks is spent information gathering. The next 2 weeks is spent summarizing that information and sharing it in advance with your board or whomever will be involved in the strategy formulation. And then in that last week, you spend a day or a day and a half at a retreat with all those individuals to actually formulate the strategy and begin to develop an implementation plan. So let me just really briefly share with you. So information gathering, so that involves things, it really involves starting with what do you want to learn, And then what's the fastest way we can learn that? Who are the people, the organizations, the websites, the reports, the needs assessments, whatever, that can inform our thinking about whatever it is we actually need to know in order to formulate our strategy or refresh our strategy in the next 6 weeks. Not everything in the world we could possibly learn, right? But what do we actually need to know that we don't already know? So you do that data gathering. It could be interviews. It could be reading these various reports and documents. You could assign your staff to be doing some of this work. You could assign your strategic planning consultant to do some of that work. But really gather all that information and then summarize it very briefly. So really here you want to identify what are the themes, what are the surfacing any concerns, what are some of the opportunities, what are possible scenarios or recommendations of what we might want to do going forward, and then share that as a brief written summary or maybe a PowerPoint deck, along with whatever other key materials might be helpful to your board in advance of the retreat, and then spend that planning session really sharing what those themes are and discussing them, establishing your plan, and gaining alignment as to how to prioritize your work going forward, and then developing accountabilities as to, before you walk out the door, who's taking responsibility for what and by when. And let me just give you an example, a sort of a sample retreat agenda. So again, I'm imagining this as an 8-hour or less one-day meeting. Many people like to break it in half, do one day and then a day or two or a couple weeks in between, and do a second half day, or it could be a day and a half if you need more time. But simply, and just to be as straightforward as possible, making sure everyone knows everyone and getting clear on the goals. What's our destination? That by the end of the day or end of this retreat, what will we have accomplished? Spending about an hour debriefing that information and having some discussion questions where you're really trying to help them really understand and unpack the findings. What does that mean? What's surprising? What are the epiphanies we have about our work going forward? Then spend about an hour identifying what is that ideal state that I was talking about. What's that desired future state for the foundation? What do we want to be 1 year from now? What kind of impact do we want to be 1 year from now? Are we achieving our goals? And where are we misaligned and falling short? And how do we get to our ideal state? And then, of course, you need a break for lunch. And then spending about an hour and a half working on your defining actions. So given our ideal state and getting agreement on the ideal state that we want to be at, what are the top 3 actions? Brainstorm of the different actions you could take, but then prioritize what are the top 3 actions that you want to take in order to accomplish your goal of getting to that ideal state in the next year. And really thinking about what's the most significant things we can do. Because in this case, there's 20% of activities that are going to drive 80% of the result. So what are those 20% of activities that are really going to make everything happen? And focus on what those are. And then make sure, and this is really important, make sure that at the end you've dedicated sufficient time to identifying, to wrapping up and figuring out, okay, who's taking responsibility for what? I mean, naming names. What are they going to be doing? What are some of those immediate action steps? By when? And what's our plan for checking in on ourselves to make sure that we're implementing this plan, or we're course correcting, because of course, if you're 80% there, you move. Real briefly, and I'll share this also in the white paper that I'll be sending to all of you, there's lots of different ways to spend the 6 weeks, right? And this is just an alternative 6-week strategy, how to spend that time, where you have actually more time in planning sessions with leadership teams. So this has a truncated information gathering, but a 2-day session with the executive leadership, some follow-up to check on your assumptions, engaging a larger body of people into really kind of focusing on the plan, and then spending the last 2 weeks on detailed planning work with teams and really finalizing what's our plan going to be going forward, not only this year, but in the next few quarters. So it's a different way to get to the same result. Now, I want to share with you, in the remaining 5 minutes, 6-hour strategy. So this is fun. So this is a really fun exercise that you can do with your whole organization, unless your easel paper falls down. I just grab my notes. or your team, or a program area, or even yourself, right? So this is, I call the spider chart, and this is just 8 lines, and you basically identify the areas of your foundation that are most important to you. And think about, again, what is your ideal future state in each of these areas? And then figure out, so what I've put for this foundation I just made up, they have 3 program areas. They're trying to end homelessness, improve access to high-quality pre-K, and expand arts education. They're really seeking to double down on policy advocacy as a strategy. They want to streamline their operations because they've been coming to all of my live stream webinars, and they want to implement what they're learning. The foundation's growing, and they want to prepare for their growth. They want to have strong grantee relationships. That's really important. And branding and communications is another area for work. And so what you do very simply with this is you talk about what is our ideal future state in each of these areas. What would that look like? And then you ask yourselves, where are we right now? So if you think about this as like a 0 to 10 scale going out, where 0 is we're doing nothing or we're not achieving any success, and 10 is like we're going gangbusters, we're totally on target, rate yourselves. So for a pre-K, for let's say homelessness, we're making a lot of strides. We're maybe at a 7. Pre-K and arts education, we're kind of low because the superintendent is not on board. We don't have good relationships with all the key players. No one knows what's going on. The initiatives have been stalled. Policy advocacy, we've made some progress, but we have a ways to go. We're very streamlined. We're pretty good. We have a pretty good plan for preparing for our growth. Our grantee relationships are okay. We did our grantee survey, and it wasn't as exciting as we thought. Branding and communications, we really haven't started yet. And so then you kind of just draw a picture of what that looks like. And then you say, well, where do we want to be, right? And you don't necessarily need to be at 10 and everything, but we certainly want to make a lot of improvements. We're pretty good at streamlining. We don't need an exchange. Of course, we want to be a little more prepared for growth. We really want to have better relationships with grantees. We really want to get our branding off the ground. And homelessness, we're making pretty good progress. And so you chart that, and you can see, the difference, where you want to be, right? But instead of going to just, okay, how do we go from here to here, and here to here, and here to here, you actually first take a step back, and you say to yourself, what are the themes that we're seeing, and are there any areas in here where if we focused on one of them, it would actually impact the rest? And I would say if you really focused on branding and communications, that would certainly improve your relationships with grantees, probably improve your policy advocacy strategy, and it would certainly improve these 2 program areas where there's been a lot of communications and relationship problems. And so, of course, you can figure out where to go in all of these areas. But you can also figure out where to focus your time. And you can spend the rest of your 6 hours figuring out how to go about doing that. And again, I would recommend coming up with clear accountabilities before you walk away from that meeting, who's going to do what by when. Okay, so that concludes all the ideas and recommendations I have for you. I'm more than happy to talk to you offline about any of these ideas and strategies to help you brainstorm how to incorporate them. As I mentioned or hopefully you all know that your subscription to this live stream includes a free 1-hour coaching call with me, so feel free to reach out and ask me for advice, and we can schedule a time. And I look forward to having you join me on May 17th for our next live stream, which is on becoming more innovative as a foundation. Thank you very much.